time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The decision didn't just land it detonated with the kind of terrifying finality Harry and Meghan had never been forced to confront before. Because inside that packed Supreme Court chamber, with every eye fixed forward and every breath seemingly frozen, the ruling was finally read aloud. Their remaining royal titles were permanently removed, the legal road had slammed shut, and there was no further route left to restore what had just been taken away. But somehow, even that wasn't the most brutal moment, because almost immediately afterward came the private blow that turned a courtroom defeat into something far more personal. Meghan's final private plea had reached William, and the future king rejected it. Just like that. No rescue, no last-minute family intervention, no secret escape hatch. And suddenly, what looked like a constitutional ending began to feel like the final fracture of a family already hanging by a thread. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry barely moved when the words were spoken, but his hand tightened against the desk while Meghan leaned toward their legal advisor with one urgent question burning through everything else. Had William answered her message? The Supreme Court, the highest court inside this dramatized constitutional conflict, had closed the path they had fought so desperately to preserve, and the consequences reached far beyond ceremonial language. Official references, palace protocol, formal invitations, and the institutional connection tying the Sussexes to royal status were suddenly being rewritten. Yet Meghan appeared focused on something even more immediate. Her plea had gone directly to William, asking not merely for sympathy, but for public recognition of the titles, even if the court itself refused to maintain them. Harry seemed to understand what was coming before she did. Then the response arrived. Short, controlled, devastating. William would not intervene. William stood over the printed plea inside his office and read it twice, because this was no ordinary family request, and he understood exactly what accepting it could mean. If private family pressure could somehow override a final constitutional decision, what would stop every future ruling from becoming another behind-the-scenes negotiation? That question seemed to swallow whatever personal emotion might have remained. He placed the page face down, looked toward his private secretary, and delivered the instruction with chilling restraint. No response beyond the formal acknowledgement. Calm words, enormous consequences. Charles received confirmation soon afterward, and suddenly the weight of everything became impossible to ignore. The king had spent months leaving space for compromise, hoping some narrow doorway might remain open, but his son had now closed the very door Charles himself had hesitated to shut. He read the briefing, put it down without speaking, and finally asked whether Harry had been told directly. Yes, and that mattered enormously, because now there could be no confusion, no convenient misunderstanding, no possibility of pretending the refusal had simply come from distant lawyers or anonymous courtiers. But beneath the legal arguments lurked one deeply uncomfortable question. Why had Meghan believed William might still save them after everything that had already happened? That answer wasn't sitting inside the courtroom. It was buried inside years of wounded loyalty, unfinished conversations, old expectations, and family promises that apparently survived long after trust itself had begun collapsing. Behind all that constitutional language stood four people carrying completely different versions of the same disaster. Harry saw the ruling as the final severing of an identity attached to him since birth. Meghan saw William's refusal as confirmation that the palace door had finally slammed shut. William viewed the situation through another lens entirely, an obligation to protect the crown from being dragged into yet another cycle of bargaining, exceptions, accusations, and private promises. And Charles was trapped in perhaps the cruelest position imaginable: king to one son, father to another. When Harry heard Meghan confirm the refusal, he stood before she had even finished speaking, pushed his chair backward, walked away from the table, and left her staring at the unanswered papers between them. Because for him, this wasn't simply about wording on stationery. A royal title represented public identity, family history, birth, duty, memory, and institutional belonging. Meghan understood immediately that something deeper had been cut away. She remained behind, reading the response again, realizing that years of disputes over representation, ceremonial access, privileges, and palace statements had transformed an intensely personal conflict into an institutional war. She initially expected lawyers to have shaped William's answer. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The central wording had come directly from him. Suddenly, there was no faceless courtier to blame, no distant office absorbing responsibility. The future king had made the choice himself. William carried that decision differently. He opened a sealed chronology maintained throughout months of private negotiations. A cold-dated record containing meetings meetings, rejected compromises, written requests, and repeated attempts to settle the Sussex dispute away from public view. This was not, in his mind, one explosive act of anger. Every page represented another failed attempt, another confrontation, another reason to believe that creating one more exception would simply manufacture the next crisis. Charles read the briefing later and immediately understood the logic, even agreeing with much of it, but when he reached the final paragraph, he removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and sat silently while an aide waited nearby. Because beneath the constitutional machinery was a memory no document could erase. Harry, as the younger son, following his brother through palace corridors, long before titles became weapons and family conversations required legal preparation. Finally, Charles asked the question hanging over everything. Had William left any room for reconsideration? The answer was no. Yet buried inside that chronology was something even more disturbing, a single encounter months earlier that had apparently changed the tone of everything that followed. Harry did not yet understand how heavily that moment had influenced his brother. Meghan did not know either. William did. And somewhere inside those pages sat the private Windsor meeting that would become the true point of no return. That private Windsor meeting was supposed to stop the disaster before it became irreversible, but instead it became the moment everything began collapsing. William had agreed to one final conversation with Harry about the Sussex name, titles, and royal associations, and Charles had encouraged it because there was still hope that two brothers speaking without lawyers or courtiers might accomplish what months of negotiations had failed to achieve. Harry arrived expecting movement, but when the discussion reached ceremonial recognition and the future relationship with the crown, the atmosphere changed. William insisted that future recognition had to follow formal constitutional rules rather than private family preference. Harry's expression hardened. Removing the titles, he argued, would not merely alter protocol. It would make Meghan and their children appear deliberately erased from royal history. Then came the document. Harry placed a prepared demand on the table asking for written confirmation that the Sussex titles would continue receiving public recognition regardless of any future court judgment or parliamentary action. William read it slowly and realized this was no longer reassurance being requested, it was a guarantee. William refused. He pushed the document back and made clear he would not promise something the crown might have no lawful authority to preserve. Harry eventually stood and walked away, leaving the unsigned paper behind while William remained seated staring at it. That abandoned document became the dividing line, and months later it would return emotionally when Meghan approached William with one final plea. By then, legal options were almost exhausted. Meghan bypassed advisors, attorneys, and intermediaries because this request was personal. William agreed to hear her privately, but the boundary had already been drawn. He would neither challenge the court's independence nor promise constitutional interference. Meghan spoke first about identity, arguing that stripping the titles would appear far more brutal than a technical adjustment because Harry, their children, and their entire branch of the family could look pushed outside royal history. William listened before answering that identity could not depend upon privileges the institution might no longer legally maintain. Then, Meghan narrowed the request dramatically. Even if official records lost the titles, could they remain privately recognized inside the family? No public announcement. No challenge to judges. Just private acknowledgement behind closed doors. For one moment, this looked like the tiniest remaining opening. William shut it. A private exception, he believed, could eventually become another public controversy through one letter, invitation, or account of a family gathering. Meghan stopped speaking. William lowered his voice and delivered the sentence that ended the bargaining: "I will not create another promise that cannot be kept." The personal route was finished. Now the machinery began moving. William studied the constitutional briefing while Charles urged caution, fearing that an excessively cold palace response would convince Harry that his father had abandoned him completely. But officials delivered the detail that destroyed the last comfortable compromise. Historic family usage could not preserve titles once formal recognition disappeared. William reached the crucial protocol instruction covering departments, invitations, briefing notes, ceremonial records, and official communications. Then came the order: use the lawful form everywhere, no exceptions. The titles vanished not through ceremony, but through corrections a website changed, invitations altered, forms of address replaced. Harry finally saw his own name written without the identity he had defended and placed the communication unopened on the table. Meghan understood the wound instantly. Then she learned William had personally approved the no exceptions protocol. Charles attempted something smaller. One family letter was addressed simply to Harry, avoiding both the former title and code legal terminology. Harry opened that letter. Eventually, Charles and Harry met alone, without lawyers or secretaries. Harry demanded to know whether his father had fought for him. Charles admitted seeking gentler language but refusing to challenge the judgment itself. When Harry asked about William, Charles explained that the refusal had not been revenge but resistance to promising something the institution could not guarantee. Then, Charles slid a handwritten note across the table. Its message was simple. The monarchy had changed his formal place, but the family had not erased him. Harry folded it and placed it inside his jacket. Outside, however, headlines exploded. Meghan became angry when commentators portrayed her approach to William as desperation. Harry refused invitations to respond publicly. William rejected attempts to frame the judgment as his personal victory. Charles remained quiet. There would be no reversal, no secret agreement, no final intervention. Meghan finally understood another appeal to William would change nothing. William signed the completed protocol file and declared the matter finished. Charles could preserve family contact but not reverse the constitutional outcome. Harry and Meghan moved forward without the titles they had fought to preserve, while William carried the burden of enforcing the boundary. And the monarchy moved forward too, not untouched, not triumphant, but permanently changed by the cost of choosing the crown over one last family exception.